Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now on episode 38 of Untold Evidence. In a Soviet research facility in the late 1960s, a woman sat at a table. In front of her, inside a glass aquarium, a frog's heart had been removed and was kept beating using saline solution. She was asked to stop it. According to Soviet researchers, she did. The woman's name, which I'm about to severely butcher, was Ninel Kulagina. The Soviet state for nearly 2 decades funded research into whether human beings could affect physical objects using nothing but their minds. The American Central Intelligence Agency, which monitored the program, took it seriously enough to launch their own. This is one of my favourite topics in all UFO disclosure conspiracy. I'm not sure whether I believe it. I'm not sure how it's possible, but I do think there is evidence to stack up to say that we should start listening to it. The history of Soviet psychic research goes back further than most people realise. In 1922, the Russian physiologist Vladimir Bekhterev founded the Brain Institute in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. One of its declared research subjects was what the scientists called biological radio. The hypothesis that the human nervous system could detect or transmit signals over distance without conventional sensory channels. The program took multiple forms over the following decades. In the 1960s and 70s, under General Secretary Bekhterev, it was significantly expanded. The Soviet Academy of Science, the KGB, and a number of military research institutes all funded variants of psychic research. The umbrella term in Russian was a word I have no chance of pronouncing, but it translated bioenergoinformatika. The term was, in some Soviet documents, using interchangeably with parapsychology. In other words, it was treated as strictly technical, materialistic, scientific discipline. Now that is important. The two superpowers during the late 20th century focused their efforts on real scientific parameters. The most famous Soviet psychic test subject was Ninel Kulagina, a housewife from Leningrad, born in 1926, a volunteer subject in Soviet psychokinesis experiments from approximately 1964 onwards. In a series of lab tests documented in Soviet research papers and on film, she was reported to have done several things. She was reported to have moved small objects on a table, matches, cigarette holders, glass vials, without touching them. She was reported to have separated the yolk from the white of an egg, inside an unbroken shell. And in the most contested experiment, she was reported to have stopped the heart of a frog that had been kept beating outside of its body in saline solution. The frog heart experiment was filmed. The film exists. It is in archive collections. What the film actually shows is a separate question. We'll come to that, don't worry. So Soviet doctors who attended the experiment reported physical effects on Kulagina herself. An elevated pulse, elevated blood pressure, glucose levels in the blood that fluctuated unusually during the testing sessions. The Soviet press published photos of her performing what they described as a psychokinetic feat in the late 1960s. In the early 1970s, American intelligence agencies became aware of the scope of the Soviet program. The CIA response, launched in 1972, was a program initially called Project Stargate. It evolved through the 1970s and 80s into what we know now as Project Stargate. The American program focused heavily on remote viewing, that alleged ability of human subjects to perceive distant locations or events using only mental focus, bypassing all known physics as we see it today. It was based on the Sanford Research Institute in California under the direction of physicists Russell Targ and the famous or infamous Hal Puthoff. The program ran for approximately 23 years. It cost nearly 20 million American dollars. That's a documented number from declassified CIA assessments. It is, by Cold War spending methods, modest. By psychic research standards, enormous. It was officially terminated in 1995 following an external review by the American Institute for Research, which concluded that the program had not produced operationally useful intelligence. This is a highly contested topic that we're very likely to dig deeper into, because some of the stories and anecdotes from this program truly are remarkable. In the Soviet Union, meanwhile, research continued through the 1980s. In 1986, the Soviet Council of Ministers approved a 5-year research program under the unwieldy formal title of State Standard Program of the Investigation of Anomalous Phenomena Using Means and Methods of Modern Science. That's a loose translation. The Russian version is much longer. The program was directed by senior Soviet Air Force official Boris Sokolov, the same Sokolov whose later books would document Soviet UFO investigations and whose work was referenced in our previous episode of Kapustin Yar. The program involved approximately 20 Soviet scientists. It produced classified reports. Most of these reports have been partially declassified in the post-Soviet period. It's very important to note a large portion of these reports are still classified. What survived translation suggests that the program treated psychic research not as occult speculation, but as an open scientific question. The research described controlled experiments, statistical analysis, negative results, alongside positive ones. That itself is notable. A propaganda program would not document failures. A scientific program may well. Now, the case for skepticism. Soviet physics research, like American psychic research, has been the subject of intense external review. The frog heart experiment involving Kulagina was examined frame by frame by external researchers, has been argued by skeptics to be consistent with a number of conventional explanations, including mechanical disturbance of the saline solution from the experiment's own movements, and natural electrical variability in disconnected cardiac tissue. Cardiac tissue, when removed from a body and kept in saline solution, naturally varies in its rate of contractions over time. It will eventually stop on its own. The matchstick experiment, in similar reviews, have been argued to be consistent with the subtle hand movements, static electricity, or thin threads. Kulagina herself was, at one point, charged with fraud in connection with current speculation in the early 1970s. Soviet skeptics argued that this raised the credibility questions. Soviet defenders argued her unrelated legal trouble said nothing about whether her psychokinetic abilities was real or not, and both sides do have a point. The American Stargate program, in its own internal review documents, noted significant statistical anomalies in some categories of remote viewing. It also noted that the particular value of any positive results was limited by the inability to identify in advance which subjects would produce reliable information. That is, in plain English, even if some psychic effect was real, you couldn't tell when it was happening, which makes it nearly useless for intelligence purposes. So here is where the Soviet psychic research actually sits in historical records. It happened. It was extensive, and it was state-funded. It produced a literature in Russian that runs into thousands of pages. Most of the experimental claims have, on detailed external examination, either been replicated weakly or not at all, or have plausible conventional explanations. The American Stargate program, running in parallel for 2 decades, reached similar conclusions. But here's the structural detail that is not easily dismissed. 2 superpowers for nearly 30 years funded scientific research into whether human consciousness could affect physical reality in ways that conventional science says it cannot. Both programs employed experienced researchers. Both were classified. Both produced documents that, in some cases, are still partly classified today. The official conclusion of both programs was that the effects, if real, were not strong enough or reliable enough to justify continued investment. That's the official conclusion. Whether it is the complete one is something that the surviving researchers mostly elder or deceased, occasionally suggesting interviews, is more of a complicated question. Names matter and records matter. This is one of my favourite topics to talk about within this sphere. If you're interested, have questions, have some follow-up questions, or want a follow-up video, please comment below and we'll get that sorted for you. In the meantime, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode of Untold Evidence.